I make mistakes running D&D, so you don't have to. This time, I started a new experimental campaign where I can try things out without fear of messing them up too bad. And boy, did I mess them up bad. I wanted this to be an evil campaign, just to see what all the rage was about. Where it is now, you could still consider it an evil campaign, but when we started out, we tried very hard to make it specifically evil, and a lot of things just didn't feel right from the get-go. Neither the players or the characters are sadists. They don't like causing suffering for suffering's sake. Instead, all the characters are only out for themselves, which is sort of evil, but it's not as evil. Slowly, it became more and more of a neutral campaign instead of an evil one, but all the characters still hold a certain disregard for the lives of others. One player was born in hell, and she's out collecting souls to bolster her father's devil army. Another player is trying to take down the death cult that he started, and he's trying to kill one of his daughters. And the third PC's goals are still a secret to this point. Since all the characters are extremely selfish, it has been difficult for me to keep the party together. So far, that's been the biggest challenge of this campaign, is keeping their goals aligned. It's not impossible. I've done it. They're still on the same path. But it hasn't been easy. Fighting against the antagonist because we're friends or because it's the right thing to do doesn't really work when the entire party is made up of selfish assholes. One of the starting characters was a class that I had helped one of my players homebrew, the Soul Slinger. Essentially, the Soul Slinger steals the souls of the subsequently slain. And yes, we had that running joke for a long time where everything just started with S. It made session recaps hilarious for a bit, though it did get old pretty quickly. The spells they cast gained certain bonuses depending on the challenge rating and alignment of the creature that soul was from. Initially, I loved this idea as a wizard subclass, not as a whole class on its own, but the player was adamant that he wanted to build an entirely new class instead of just a couple extra rules. So I went along with it, despite my better judgment. We ended up creating something pretty cool, even if it was a little underpowered in the end. But there's still a lesson to be learned here. If the player wants to do something, even if you think it's a bad idea, it might sometimes be the right decision to just let them do it anyway. It could end up being really fun, especially for the player that wanted to do it in the first place. But I'm still going to rework it into a wizard subclass. To make sure you know when this subclass comes out, go ahead and subscribe and hit the bell so that you get a notification when it drops. I already mentioned that this Soul Slinger class was underpowered. The proof of this is that the Soul Slinger was killed pretty early on in the campaign. The troll that slew him was a little too powerful for the party at that level. I did design the counter to be extremely difficult, so I'm not exactly surprised that one of the characters died. This PC death in particular taught me two things. First, the Soul Slinger class is underpowered and needs rebalancing. And the second is that player character death doesn't always have to be meaningful. When the character was making death saves, the player actually told me specifically to do what the troll would do, not to save his character just for his sake. So the hungry troll bit his head off. The characters, being evil and selfish, did not mourn him at all. And the players didn't care either, so they just moved right along. Every single piece of advice about player character death has been about how to make it meaningful and important. This campaign taught me that that's not always needed, though it's probably an exception because this is an evil campaign, and they hadn't played long enough to get attached to their characters yet. Another reason it wasn't super important when the Soul Slinger died is because the characters almost die every single other combat too. I tend to run combat at a pretty high difficulty because the party usually gets a long rest between each big fight. I wanted to push that to the limit for this experimental campaign, so I've made everything a little bit more difficult than I already would have, and they've had to rely on short rests instead of long rests, which has worked out because most of their classes actually benefit a lot from short rests. But in most combats, someone usually gets knocked unconscious, drops to 0 hit points, and the players are starting to get tired of that. I personally like challenging combats. It feels like I've achieved something when it's over and we've won. But it can be annoying if every single time you roll initiative, you know one of you is not going to make it out of there in one piece. It also doesn't give the players a sense that their characters are growing in power at all. Difficult combat is fine, but it has to be interspersed with easier fights. I'll probably have the party fight that troll again so they can wipe the floor with it and see how much they've grown. I find that easily defeating something that was at one point a difficult boss fight is a great way to show the players and the characters the power increase they've had and how much they've grown since then. Going into this campaign, I had no idea what the plot was going to be. I've only ever planned the next session for this game, and never further than that. There were never any real villains, just people and NPCs from characters' backstories. It took a long time for the party to find something to fight against together, because I wasn't putting down anything obvious in front of them. This is the first evil campaign I've ever run, so I was floundering trying to figure out what the antagonist of an evil campaign should be. Eventually, I created 2 entities for them to choose from, a group of paladins called the Dawn Knights, and the cult the paladins were after. Each of these organizations is led by a daughter of one of the player characters. I had no idea what the players' reactions would be to these groups, so I had each one attack them individually to see what their reaction would be. The whole time, I had to consciously keep my mind open to making either one the main antagonistic force of the campaign. The paladins actually attacked them in the first session, and that was initially the binding force that was keeping this selfish party together. The cult is a xenophobic death cult, so they've attacked the party and tried to kill them on sight, and that's happened several times at this point. Right now, both of these groups are still kind of antagonists to them. I'm not sure which one they'll choose, or if they'll choose one at all. Honestly, I still have no idea where the plot is going at this point, and I'm learning more and more as I play this game that that's okay. Normally, I'd plan out all the plot points beforehand. I would know who the villain is and where the final battle is going to take place before the first session even starts. But the longer this campaign goes on, the more I realize I don't have to plan that far ahead. I really only need an antagonist with a goal, and I can play everything after that by ear. Remember, everything is going to be okay.